We're going to talk about pushrod adjustment, and before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the anatomy of the lifter, or give people a visual on what you're actually doing when you adjust a pushrod. So what we have here is a stock twin cam lifter. It's been cut away so that you can kind of see the internals. Basically you have a spring, a one-way valve up here in this piston body, and then you have the cup for the push rod to fit into in the top, and a retaining pin. Okay, and so what you're doing when you're adjusting the push rod is the gap between the piston and the bottom of the lifter, you're closing that gap. And so for the lifter to do its job and adjust or compensate for the growth in engine height, and as things warm up and change distances, the hydraulic lifter, of course, this travel has to change and take all the valve lash so that your valve train is quiet. So what you're trying to do is to give this the maximum adjustment. You want to adjust this piston so that it's in the center of that travel, in between this distance here. Well, if you measure this with the calipers, it's roughly 200 thousandths of an inch. And so what we want to do is adjust this down about 100 thousandths of an inch. So an S&S pushrod has 32 thousandths, or 32 threads per inch. So one revolution gives you 32 thousandths of length in the pushrod. So as we try to achieve 100 thousandths, we would want to go one turn at 32 thousandths, two turns at 64, three turns at 96, and then just over three turns is going to give you that 100 thousandths. So what we generally refer to for adjustment on a pushrod is flats. Anytime you're talking in terms of flats, you're essentially referring to a six-sided hexagonal shape. And so you stick a wrench on a set of flats, because a wrench is basically shaped like this, and so you turn it once, pull the wrench off, and turn it to the next flat on that hex. And so when we turn it 20 flats, we would do that 20 times, okay? Or sometimes they refer to that as 2.5 turns or 3.5 turns, that kind of thing. So it can be termed both ways, either flats or in the number of turns. So another topic that we should cover would be the limited travel spacers. S&S has a product called a LT kit. It's a limited travel washer. What this washer does is basically turns your hydraulic lifter into a solid lifter. You could take a set of hydraulic lifters out of an engine, and generally speaking, putting a set of solids in their place would, of course, not give like a hydraulic lifter will. And so the advantage there is that you don't have the collapsing of the lifter under high RPM. And so the LT kit, of course, is going to maintain valve control and not collapse the lifter at high RPM, so that we get the benefit of improved timing. So generally speaking, if you were to put a solid lifter in place of a hydraulic, you would certainly achieve more horsepower, and that is the whole idea behind the LT kit. So what effectively happens when you put this in this lifter is that 200 thousandths I was talking about becomes roughly 100 thousandths. And so when we adjust this lifter down to that washer, we've now raised the floor up and taken away some of this travel. There's still, of course, oil inside of this LT kit, so there's a reservoir of oil there that can, of course, work its way through the one-way valve and pump up the lifter. But we bring the plunger down, or the piston down, so that it is essentially just above that limited travel spacer or washer. And then we will bring it down so it touches, and then we back it off one full turn, so 6 flats. And I'll go through that procedure here actually on a bike, so that we can understand better how to do it in the real environment. So with the limited travel spacer installed, you have the benefit of a solid lifter with the quiet performance of a hydraulic lifter. We're going to talk about adjustable push rods here. S&S has 2 versions of adjustable push rods. We have the standard push rod here, which is the cheaper of our push rods. It in a twin cam, it installs without removing the rocker boxes. Basically, it would have to go up and in, and you need to remove the tappet cover. Okay, so not too inconvenient. Very feasible. At least you don't have to remove the rocker box. We also have the quickie push rod, and if you can see how the quickie push rod collapses much farther than the standard push rod. And the advantage of that is, of course, that you can install it without removing the tappet cover. Okay. The standard push rod, also on an Evolution engine, you would have to remove the rocker boxes to use the standard push rod. So if a guy switches to the quickie, you certainly have a little bit more expensive push rod, but you certainly will save the money in labor without the added expense of removing the rocker boxes and, of course, the tappet cover on a twin cam. The S&S pushrod kit comes as you see it here, and it has these tubes and, of course, the clips. The tubes that come with it are necessary because the stock tube is substantially longer, and, of course, since it's longer, you can't push it up far enough on the motor to be able to get at the adjuster underneath here. And I'll kind of show you right here. If that tube, if the stock tube was in this scenario, you would cover up the adjuster and you wouldn't be able to get at it. Okay, so when you buy a set of S&S push rods, they come with a set of tubes so that you can basically install them without taking anything else apart. All right, we're going to go through the procedure to adjust push rods, install and adjust. I've already got one push rod in here, kind of for a visual purpose, but first thing you do before you install a push rod or start adjusting them is to make sure that you have the cam or the cylinder that you're going to install the push rods into on the base circle. And how we do that is basically we raise the vehicle with a proper jack, pull the spark plugs, and put the transmission in high gear. So to find the proper location of the base circle on say the rear cam we're going to set up for, I'm going to watch for overlap on the front cam. Okay, so I want to know when both of these lifters are moving. I'm just going to spin the rear wheel, and the outer lifter is, of course, the exhaust, the inner is the intake, and right now I have them both moving. Okay, and of course I could see that this one was not moving at the same time. So I have the front cam on overlap, the rear cam is on the base circle. Now this particular engine has a set of S&S Easy Start cams, and what that means is on the exhaust lobe we have the compression release trigger. Okay, so if you were to put the cam on the base circle and actually stop on that trigger, your valve or push rod would be opened 20-25 thousandths, okay? And that would give you an erroneous adjustment. So what you need to look for on the exhaust push rod is that you're not on the top of that trigger. And what we'll do now is we'll put in the exhaust push rod, and I'll show you that we're not on that trigger, or we'll look for that to move. So I got a set of quickie push rods here. S&S tubes. I have my O-ring in place, top and bottom. I'm going to slide this in place, extend the adjuster, and run it down until we basically feel the push rod get tight in the cup of the rocker arm up in the box, and of course the cup in the lifter. And that's what we would call, zero lash, or run them down till you have no lash or up and down movement in the push rod. Okay, so I can feel the push rod. You can hear it moving there. I have a little bit of lash, and I back it out just a little bit, and I can feel it getting tight. Okay, and then there's the adjuster nut that I held up as I was moving the adjuster down. So that's right there ready to be snugged up. Okay, these push rods have 32 threads per inch, so my target is essentially 20 flats or 3 1/3 turns. Okay, so I'm going to hold the bottom part of the adjuster, and I'm going to turn the top part of the push rod 20 flats when I go to adjust it. Okay, first we're going to show you the compression release set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this push rod real quick so we can see it kind of move up and down. Throw a little white marker on here for you. Okay. Now we're going to look for the little bump of the compression release. Right there it was. See it move up and down ever so slightly? You can hear it click actually too as it goes past the lifter. So I'm rotating the motor forward and the wheel, of course, in the direction of normal rotation. And as I see that, now I'm going to rotate it forward, as I see that lifter go up and come back down, I know I'm on the base circle of the cam, and then I am past or not on the compression release trigger. So now I'm ready to adjust this rear cylinder on the exhaust and the intake. Okay. So using a 1/4 inch wrench on the bottom of the adjuster and a 7/16 wrench on the push rod, I'm at 0 lash. I'm going to take this push rod and extend it 20 flats. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. $20 flats right there. Now, knowing that I'm at the right adjustment, I'm going to grab another 7/16 and I'm going to tighten that adjuster nut. Okay. Now, one thing you'll notice, of course, right away is that what we did by adjusting that after we got to 0 lash, we have compressed the valve spring and, of course, opened the valve. So right now, the valve is open basically 100 thousandths because that's what we lengthened the push rod by. So slowly over time here in the next few minutes, this lifter is going to squeeze the oil out of it. Okay, that piston's going to go down to the center of the adjustment, and this push rod is going to start to spin freely. Okay, and that is important to note because before you can move on to the other cylinder, you must wait for this thing to bleed down, or what will happen is your valve will actually open farther than it should because the lifter hasn't collapsed, and it will contact your piston, bend your valves, and ruin your day. So wait for it to bleed down. You should be able to turn it with your fingers. That's a good, and I certainly cannot turn that with my fingers. So while I'm waiting for this one to bleed down, I'm going to go on. Actually, I've already adjusted the rear one, so that one we can see is I can spin with my fingers. So we wait for this one to bleed down, and then we will rotate the engine so that we have overlap in the rear. Verify that we are not on the Easy Start compression release trigger, and adjust the front push rods. Install and adjust. Okay, it's been about 5 or 7 minutes now, and the push rod is free spinning with my fingers, so the lifter has collapsed. So we can move on to the front cylinder. Now, if we had the limited travel kit installed in this lifter, we would have done the adjustment differently, kind of as follows. We would have adjusted it down the 20 flats and waited for the lifter to bleed down, okay, giving it 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Give it a half an hour if you like. Just give it plenty of time to bleed down. And so once you've given it the time to bleed down, you start to back off the push rod, and when the push rod gets free, in other words, the spring has closed the valve and all of a sudden the push rod now has no resistance on it to spin, you'll be able to feel that as you back the wrench off. And so you count backwards from 20 flats, 19, 18, generally at 18 flats, okay, the LT kit on a twin cam at 18 flats will start to come loose. And so from that, you are now bottomed, the piston is now inside the tappet, is now bottomed on that that LT kit, that washer, and you're going to back the adjustment off 1 full turn, or 6 flats. Okay, so back it off 6 flats, lock it down, and when you're done with the assembly of the rest of the bike, fire it up and give them some time to pump up. So while we're waiting for these push rods and lifters to bleed down so that we can spin them, I want to just take some time to talk about a variety of products that are out there. You could have push rods from any manufacturer with whatever threads per inch, and a lifter from any manufacturer, as long as it's a hydraulic one with a given amount of travel. We don't know what it is, it doesn't matter. But you should be able to adjust hydraulic tappets on any V-twin, not knowing what the threads per inch is, not knowing what the travel in the lifter is, by simply getting the cam on the base circle, making sure that you are indeed on the base circle. Like we mentioned here, if you have easy start cams, you have the compression release trigger to contend with. Make sure that you're not on that trigger. But as long as you're on the base circle of the cam, and you've taken the lash out of the push rod, then basically what you want to do is adjust that push rod longer, okay, and adjust it, 20, 40 flats. Start small so that you make sure you don't open the valve too far. But basically you can keep lengthening a push rod, and it may take you longer to do this procedure, but if you don't have the instruction sheets or you can't get on the tech line and get answers, then this is a way for you to do it yourself. So as you adjust that push rod out, okay, and it bleeds down, if it spins, you're not on the bottom of the travel of the lifter, okay? If you adjust it out and you've waited a half an hour and the lifter doesn't spin, so you've waited plenty of time for it to bleed down, okay, and it doesn't spin, you know you're on the bottom of the lifter. So you start backing off that push rod until it starts to spin freely, okay, or the resistance from backing it off gets easier or reduces. So at that point, you know you're at the bottom of the lifter. You've counted how many flats you went down, and you've counted how many flats you've come back up. And at that point, say you adjusted it down 40 flats, okay? You backed it off 10, so now you're at 30 flats. Well, 30 flats from zero lash is the bottom of the travel of that lifter, okay? So if you want to be in the middle of the travel, you back it off another 15 and you lock it down. So that could be applied to any lifter and any push rod combination imaginable on a V-twin.